District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thank you so much for listening to the program.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. This week, the Securities and Exchange Commission will be closing its reopened rule on whether or not to list natural asset companies on the New York Stock Exchange. One of the integral figures fighting this rule is Utah Treasurer Marlo Oaks. Treasurer Oaks and 21 other financial officers from across the country, largely from red states, have banded together in response to the SEC closing this rule prematurely back in October. Working with congressional partners and American Stewards of Liberty, the efforts of Treasurer Oaks and his colleagues from across the country forced the SEC to reopen comment period on December 28th. This Wednesday, the SEC rule will be closing at midnight. I recently sat down with Treasurer Oaks to talk about this rule, its ties to the environmental, social, and governance movement, how it's even beyond an ESG investment because it stems from President Biden's Day One climate executive order to go net zero, and also related to 30 by 30, which is the very flawed non-conservationist plan to so-called protect 30% of waters and 30% of lands by arbitrary deadlines like 2030. Here's a little backgrounder on Treasurer Oaks. He is Utah's 26th state treasurer. He was appointed in July 2021 and then elected in November 2022 to finish his predecessor's term. Mr. Oaks spent much of his career in money management and is one of only 2 state treasurers with institutional investment management experience. Because of Treasurer Oaks' knowledge of capital markets, he is leading the fight to protect economic freedoms. What you will learn in our discussion today: why the fight against ESG has exploded, why ESG is not free market based, what threats ESG poses, especially with respect to property rights, and also federal lands access, especially with this NAC rule from the SEC, and other misconceptions about those fighting ESG. I highly recommend you look at the resources included in the show notes today. And if you have concerns and questions about this SEC NAC rule, to submit comments before the January 18th deadline. I will be submitting comments on behalf of Independent Women's Forum. I've been writing about this issue, talking about this issue on behalf of the organization and with partners like American Stewards of Liberty and CFACT. And it's really important that this rule is fought. So we're grateful to Treasurer Oaks for joining the show today, and I hope you learn more about this topic and about ESG in general. Here on the podcast, we have been talking at great length about the environmental, social, and governance movement and an offshoot of that called natural asset companies. One of the people leading the charge against this, especially as it relates to a Securities and Exchange Commission rule, is Utah Treasurer Marlo Oaks. He and 22 other financial officers from across the country have been very aggressive in responding to this rule, which was initially closed off and then reopened because of their efforts and that of other stakeholders fighting tooth and nail against this new so-called ESG listing, which we'll go into detail. And I'm really thrilled to have Treasurer Oaks on the program to discuss this. Thank you so much for joining, especially since you're very busy trying to fight this.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriella. I really appreciate the opportunity to, get the word out. That's one thing that as state treasurer, I'm not doing policy. I'm not a legislator, but a lot of what I do is educating people on things like this. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk more about it.
Could you explain what a financial officer does, like a treasurer or a state auditor? Because I think there are so many roles out there, elected positions or appointed positions, and people may conflate the work that you do perhaps with an attorney general. So could you explain exactly what a treasurer does?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because most people don't know. in the state of Utah, and every state is a little bit different, but in the state of Utah, I think of it as a chief investment officer and chief banking officer. So what that means is that I oversee a lot of investments, both internally in the treasurer's office. So we have about $34 billion in a short-term kind of money market fund that a lot of different municipalities and other public entities participate in. And then we have about a billion plus in longer term investment portfolios like endowments. I sit on the retirement system board of trustees. And then we do financial education, financial literacy. If the state needs to raise money from investors, that comes through the treasurer's office. So I view the credit rating of our state, for example, of a key asset that the treasurer really is responsible for protecting so that we can borrow money at the cheapest rates possible. So it really is, financially related. It has to do with investment management and raising money, and then education, and then of course, as a consultant to the legislature, if they're looking at spending and if that will impact the state's borrowing and what kind of impact that might have on our credit rating. So hopefully that's helpful.
I think that's a good explanation. That's how I've come to understand the position in my work, trying to extrapolate what ESG is. Why have state financial officers like yourselves begun to fight the ESG movement? When did it really take hold for you in Utah? And what specific action has Utah done, let's say against the big three, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, if you have taken any action? I know you have, so I would love you to explain, why did you get into the fight against ESG, and what specifically has Utah done?
So the treasurer's office is really at the crossroads of politics and the capital markets. In the past, politics has not seeped into the capital markets. It's really been separate. And what happened when the Biden administration took over is that they started pushing this whole of government approach. And we saw things that typically were not being pushed in corporate America. Suddenly, corporate America was being pushed to adopt ESG, essentially. The problem with that is that investing is really there's really no agenda other than to make money. People invest to reach certain financial goals, and once you introduce an agenda outside of that goal to make money, you're no longer investing. And we have very strong fiduciary law. If I'm managing money for somebody, I have a fiduciary obligation to make decisions in their best financial interest. And that's something that is under threat from ESG, because ESG introduces another agenda that goes beyond just trying to make the best financial decisions for someone. So the reason that treasurers got involved, and certainly the reason that I got involved, is because I saw ESG as a threat to our economic freedoms. And ultimately, the whole climate hysteria, that whole narrative, is it's really a pretext to change our economic system. The United Nations had a study that they commissioned back in 2018, and the headline from that from the Huffington Post was, "We cannot address climate change with capitalism," something like that. AOC's chief of staff back in 2019 said the Green New Deal wasn't originally about the climate. It was about how do you change the economic system. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he was saying. So our economic system is under attack, and it's under attack from things like ESG, and they look like they fit into our economic system, but they really change it.
I've seen a lot of proponents of ESG who happen to be very anti-capitalistic and even anti-free market, stemming from sitting in on congressional hearings with a predecessor of mine with the Independent Women's Forum. Now I lead their Center for Energy and Conservation. I sat in a hearing and I saw people who have taken consistent positions against free markets gaslighting us in attendance that this is a free market innovation, a free market strategy. And when you extrapolate that and kind of dig further, you see if you're a free market proponent that it's not, because it's essentially a tool to force behavior. It's very coercive. because you have the, let's say, Wall Street interests cooking up the idea, and then they genuflect and they kind of interact with the government and basically say, hey, government, here's your option to regulate markets through ESG. We're giving you a template to do it. The government takes it. They have done this through the Department of Labor rule. They've done this through other iterations of rulemaking in the federal agency. So how are you? I know a lot of the financial officers like yourself are pretty pro-free market. You traditionally support the free market. How are you hitting back at these accusations that you're engaging in anti-market behavior by responding to ESG, which is coercive? So how are you guys fighting that?
Yeah, no, and that's that's part of the challenge here is that it appears to fit within free market capitalism, but it does not. And so that's one of the things that I really talk about. There's a lot of fallacies around ESG and what it is, because it just appears like we're providing more information for investors. How can that be bad? It's just trying to identify risks that corporations need to be aware of, investors need to be aware of, that sort of thing. The problem is that originally, the first document that really talks about ESG is back in 2004, the UN, Who Cares Wins, and it says only if all actors contribute to the integration of ESG can significant improvements in this field be achieved. So clearly there is an agenda at work, and it's interesting that they targeted the financial services sector because money is power, and it's the financial services sector that allocates capital in our free market system. And the analogy that I use is that with our legal system, Lady Justice is wearing a blindfold. And the reason that Lady Justice is wearing a blindfold is so that the decisions made in the legal system are based on law and law alone. As soon as she removes that blindfold, then we start introducing things like empathy and deciding who has been harmed or who is the oppressed, right, and versus the oppressor, and we introduce things that are not legal based, and you corrupt the legal system. The analogy on the business side in our economic system is that decisions are made based on economics. And as soon as you introduce something other than an economic criteria for making those decisions, you corrupt the economic system. And so that's what ESG does. And it really is a top-down effort to force behavior. And that is completely counter to free market capitalism, because free market capitalism is based on the individual who is, has demands, and companies are trying to meet those demands. It's very much a bottom-up, demand-driven, consumer-driven system, very similar to our constitutional form of government, where each of us are sovereign beings who vote in our representatives. It's the individual that has the power in our system, and that's the same with our economic system. And ESG flips that on its head and it makes demands of corporations in the hopes that filters down through society to change society, and then ultimately replaces free market capitalism with some unknown system that looks much more like corporatism or fascism, where the government and corporations are working together to push agendas on society. It's very destructive.
It's absolutely destructive. And I think people forget, because we also talk about energy and environment here on the podcast. You can have a free market economy and also a healthy environment. I think a lot of people are trying to put the two in two, but it's important as we relate to free markets here on the podcast, why that's important. Treasurer Oaks, I don't know if you've seen this, but I know, having followed ESG for the better part of a few years, people have been increasingly dismissive, or initially dismissive rather, of opposition to ESG. We saw that it was deemed illegitimate. It's not a serious thing. It's maybe a partisan or Republican culture war. I looked over an article published in the Harvard Business Review. I don't know if you got a chance to see this, but there's a chart that talks about people who are understanding or engaging in anti-ESG efforts or anti-sustainability, let's say, efforts. So they're acknowledging that the efforts of you and other state financial officers, states attorneys general, et cetera, is starting to catch on and starting to catch fire. And they argue that certain interests, like vested traditional investors, like fossil fuel companies, traditional investors, and also what they deem political exploiters, some elected officials and pundits. They're not legitimate and they're not arguing in good faith when it comes to ESG. So we've seen kind of this volleying back and forth of dismissing ESG efforts. Now there has to be one correct way to criticize ESG as long as you agree with ESG ultimately. How do you respond to that?
Well, it sounds very similar to, trying to shut down debate, whatever it is. There are legitimate concerns and reasons to fight back against ESG, and those are based on sound economic principles. Our business, businesses have been under attack for a very long time. People are in business are, sometimes viewed as greedy and, just want to make as much money no matter what. But the reality is that our economic system has been the basis for more innovation and more wealth creation than any other system in the world. It's the envy of the world, and it has been under attack for a very long time. And unfortunately, people often lose sight of how that system provides each of us as consumers power to make decisions that are basically support our individual and societal freedoms. And so you do away with our economic system and you do away with the foundation of free markets, and you've lost a significant freedom, because if you don't have economic freedom, you really don't have other freedoms. And so I think the attempt to demonize people like me is really part of this overall effort to push a top-down, centralized control type of mechanism through this country, and it's incredibly dangerous, and it threatens all of our free institutions, and people hopefully will begin to connect the dots between what's happening on the economic side to what's happening with free speech and Twitter files and what happened with COVID and trying to force behavior and shutting down alternative viewpoints. And I mean, this stuff is incredibly un-American, and yet it is happening in so many different areas. It's really quite astonishing.
I think people are catching on to ESG slowly, even those who may not partake in investing directly, because I think to anyone who reads into what ESG is, it's also a socio-political kind of manifestation of progressive politics. To me, it seems like an echoing of it, especially on the environmental and social prongs, very much a preservationist environmental agenda to go net zero, to phase out. And we're also seeing kind of the fallout from that, because last year, ESG proponents, the big three, all these different firms, they were closing down mutual funds. They saw a lot of withdrawal from ESG funds. ESG did not have a great year last year, and they're forecasting a similarly shaky year. I think BlackRock announced they're laying off maybe 3% of their global workforce. They're not in a great position. So I think they're coming from a position of weakness. Yeah,
and thankfully, the market is really proving the point that one of the arguments was that ESG will result in better performance, and that just didn't make any sense economically, because once you start, if you're trying to exclude certain parts of the investment market, then you're going to either underperform or have higher volatility, higher risk in your portfolio, and clearly the performance has been dismal in some of these things that avoided, for example, fossil fuel. But also very importantly, I think some of the people who are harmed the most are really starting to push back. So there's an organization, the 200. It's in the state of California. It's a statewide coalition of founders of civil rights organizations, community and business leaders, housing advocates, former state legislators, cabinet members. So this is not a traditionally conservative, what you would think of as anti-ESG kind of group. They are suing the California Air Resource Board for the disparate impacts to California's minority population because of the climate policies that are very much part of ESG. What ends up happening is you end up with higher energy costs, not just at the pump, but to heat your home or to cool your home, and it really harms those who can least afford it. And are living with energy insecurity. We're talking about serious market disruptions. And when you disrupt the markets and push these artificial barriers and artificial impediments into markets, it distorts them and often leads to higher prices or harmful impacts to those who can't afford it.
That's why we've seen campaigns to rename ESG to forego using the term. They're using sustainability, renewable, green bonds, blue bonds, et cetera. And I think they're channeling their efforts into this next kind of subset of ESG that you've been working very, very tirelessly on combating. Natural asset companies. I saw from September 2021, the headline from Kiplinger that natural asset companies are the next ESG investment strategy or next ESG investment fund. Talk about how you and other financial officers are combating it, because we have a rule coming up from the SEC, who has no jurisdiction over lands and property, whether they're private or public. And somehow they're wanting to list this new enterprise on the New York Stock Exchange, and it has a lot of implications. So explain for the listeners who are not familiar, just learning about this, what natural asset companies entail, and then go into the SEC rule if you can.
Sure. So a natural asset company is a new kind of company, and it's not based on economic activity. It's based on natural processes. So I think of it as financializing Mother Nature. And so in order to be able to do that, because it's not based on traditional economic activity, our accounting standards are inadequate. Generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, is based on economic activity. It's objective, the dollars and cents. It's easy to track, and that's what drives our accounting standards. When you move into areas that are not economically based, like what is the value of photosynthesis, for example, our accounting standards are inadequate, and so that's why the New York Stock Exchange had to go to the Securities and Exchange Commission to get a rule that would allow them to list this kind of company, and they would have to use a different kind of accounting system, and that system is based on United Nations ecological accounting standards that basically are arbitrary in nature. They're assigning arbitrary value to natural processes that happen and really make life on Earth possible. So if you think about externalities, the concept of an externality is that it's something that all of us either are harmed by, in the case of a negative externality like air pollution, or benefit from, like clean air. And this is an effort to monetize and financialize positive externalities, things that are just happen in nature that are required to sustain life. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you create a value and you assign ownership to an externality, it is no longer an externality. Somebody owns it and they can start charging you for it. And that's the road that or the Pandora's box that we're opening up here. And so it again represents a corruption of our economic system that's based on economic activity. Because what that natural asset company is designed to do, and the whole purpose of it, is to actually go out and find land and manage for the ecological services that are happening on that land. So forest, it's photosynthesis, soil might be absorbing carbon, and so they only allow sustainable activity on that land. Which means that nothing considered unsustainable can happen on that land. And that includes things like oil extraction, mineral extraction, grazing, traditional agriculture. And so this natural asset company is actually destroying economic activity on our land, or would destroy economic activity on that land, and would seek to find land rich in natural resources and lock it up so that those natural resources could not be utilized. It is an absolute travesty, and the idea is a terrible idea, and is harmful to all of us, and we should all be against that.
I've had Margaret Byfield on the program, and she was the first person to educate me on this at her previous summit back in September. And I was combing through the SEC rule, and so many points stick out to me as problematic. And it's funny because we see a lot of people on the environmental left say, well, Republicans want to sell land and they want to commodify this. And I'm reading through this. So they want to enroll federal lands in a natural asset company. To me, that's a land grab. That's an intrusion on public lands access, which is supposed to be open for multiple uses. And also Treasurer Oaks, I don't know if you know this, hunting and fishing would also be interrupted, OTVing, ATVing as well. So it's not just the so-called extractive consumptive activities, but even the recreational stuff too. So we would see, as you've mentioned in different correspondences and letters, enrollment of federal lands. That's a huge invasion, a violation of various different rules from Congress. They don't have the authority to do that. They would also license rights to own air, water, other natural aspects to entities like BlackRock and to foreign adversaries like China. That's something they abundantly make clear. And then I think a third problematic point of all the problematic points it includes, they say that sustainable generating revenue would come from issuing carbon credits. Am I wrong there to think all those three aspects are problematic?
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought up that the outdoor recreation component, because really this is the whole goal is to reduce human impact on land. And so there is definitely a push to get motorized vehicles off of federal lands to prevent kind of traditional outdoor activity, hunting and fishing in particular, from happening. I mean, it's unbelievable the extent to which they are going to prevent human activity on the land, and it has very serious economic implications and quality of life implications for all of us. And I just think when we start commoditizing positive externalities, the clean air that we breathe, or whatever it is that we all sort of take for granted because it's absolutely necessary. When we start monetizing that and financializing that is a massive drain on all of us. If we have to somehow, seek forgiveness for our carbon emissions and buy some kind of a carbon offset that is owned by somebody who is managing the natural processes that create clean air, for example. That's the road we're going down, and it's shocking. And I hope people recognize the problem that creates. And I don't care what your politics are. We should all be against that.
Yeah, because it perverts the free market system. It creates few to oversee and own private and public lands. I would think environmental leftists, preservationists including, would be opposed to this. They would think like this is invasive, this is problematic, it would close off access. But some of them are going along because they think they can be rewarded, very similar to the BLM conservation, landscape, and health rule, which is a little outside your purview, but I have no doubt your colleagues in Utah, especially in Congress, and those, I think the Attorney General as well, have also expressed concerns. But it also invites that same problem of stopping multiple uses on public lands among the problems with obviously what it would do to private land. But it's very similar to this federal rule that's kind of in the works and soon to be finalized as well. But I am really surprised, but not surprised that we don't see the people who claim to be for public lands access not opposing this more. Have you had any interactions with people who may differ from your worldview, maybe expressing concerns? Have people who are perhaps on the center left in different interests express reservations about this, or you haven't heard anything yet?
I haven't heard anything. The one thing that is also concerning about this is there's a push to get land into conservation easements.
In perpetuity, yeah.
Yeah, and even in a state like Utah that's already 67% owned by the federal government, there's a push to get private land into conservation easements, and those could be enrolled in the NAC. And that's there's a major push across the country to get more land into conservation easements, and I'm seeing that here even in Utah. So I think there's a big educational component that is necessary to make sure that people understand the problems associated with, basically giving up property rights.
That is a big concern. But I also tell people it's not just property rights, it's also your access to public lands too, because they're not stopping at who they view as consumptive users or traditional despoilers in their mind, not my words, of the land. Although they're not despoilers, they're the people closest to it. They're using very little space comparable to what I would believe a solar farm or a wind farm would use, which are far more destructive. But those activities can be permitted on public lands if there's certain, BLM rule or if NACs were to proceed. They would be considered sustainable generating revenue enterprises, these really invasive environmental projects. But Treasurer Oaks, as we close out our episode together, could you direct people to how they can weigh in on this NAC rule, because the deadline is coming up on January 18th. So how could those who are very concerned, doesn't matter where they fall in the country, how can they weigh in and submit comments? Because you could submit a one-sentence comment or a formalized comment, correct? Opposing the NAC rule now that it's been reopened?
Yes. Yeah. So you can go to the SEC website, and I'm happy to share a link for that, so people can submit comments there. It's also really important for people to reach out to the congressional representatives, and with a special focus on financial services, the Financial Services Committee, because they oversee the Securities and Exchange Commission. So that's really important to ensure that Congress is putting pressure on the SEC as well. The other thing that people can do is reach out to the New York Stock Exchange and just tell them to pull back their proposal to the SEC. The New York Stock Exchange should not be doing this. It's clearly anti free market, and yet the New York Stock Exchange is one of the bastions of one of the institutions that really has helped our free market system, and so it's pretty astonishing because these natural asset companies could harm a lot of the companies that are already listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So it's almost like they're cannibalizing their own, their own customers. So that's another thing that people can do. And then, of course, reaching out to local legislators at the state level, the governor, things like that. So there's a lot of things that people can do, and I think the SEC and the New York Stock Exchange are probably rethinking this whole thing because of the outcry that has happened. I mean, this is a major threat. People recognize it for what it is, and are pushing back, rightfully so. And I appreciate people listening to this podcast doing the same.
And you and the other state financial officers who've worked under the kind of umbrella of the State Financial Officers Foundation have done a phenomenal job bringing attention to this. And I salute you guys for doing that, because it's very hard. This is a convoluted topic. It makes no sense on the surface. And then when you dig into it and you extrapolate the details, you see what it is. So thank you so much for fighting this and on, for preserving land rights and also public lands access, because it would be a multi-pronged problem. And Treasurer Oaks, where could people connect with you and your office to learn more about the latest updates to the NAC rule or even your efforts to fight ESG?
Yeah, so they can go to my office website, treasurer.utah.gov. We do have a natural asset companies page. We've got information also on ESG and a lot of the letters that we've sent in regards to that. People can also go to my personal website, marlooaks.com, MARLOOAKS.com. There's information there as well. And then the State Financial Officers Foundation, SFOF.com, is another great resource. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. The thing that I view kind of the treasure where this kind of the crossroads of politics and capital markets is the economic freedoms that we have, and really fighting to protect our economic freedoms. That's what I view as treasurer is one of the most important roles now, where we're seeing an attack on these economic freedoms that we have. It's really incumbent upon public officials like myself to stand up and defend the freedoms that we enjoy on the economic side of our country. And so that's really my goal.
And when there's an update to the NAC rule, would you be willing to come back on again?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Anytime. I'm happy to be helpful however I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Treasurer Oaks. And please keep us abreast with what is happening here and on ESG.
Thank you, Gabriella. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I'm all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.